The light morning rain had just stopped when I arrived at the company's headquarters earlier than usual, just as I had done for years. I had spent 7 years of my life in that building. Every hallway, every office, and every familiar face had become a part of my daily routine. I never imagined that the same place where I had devoted so much of my time and energy would one day become the scene of the greatest humiliation of my life. I was an ordinary employee, but people trusted me because of my hard work, honesty, and quiet nature. I always believed that if you worked sincerely and treated others with respect, your efforts would eventually be recognized. Unfortunately, not everyone appreciated those qualities. Some people saw honesty as a threat rather than a virtue. That morning, something felt different the moment I stepped into the office. The atmosphere was unusually tense. Conversation stopped when I walked by, and a strange silence seemed to follow me. I tried to ignore it and settled at my desk, but only a few minutes later, my manager appeared beside me. "Can you come to my office?" he asked. His tone was cold and formal. When I entered his office, I immediately noticed the human resources representative sitting beside him. Both of them wore expressions of forced seriousness. My stomach tightened. Something was wrong. My manager slid an envelope across the desk and looked at me without emotion. "Effective immediately. Your employment with the company has been terminated." For a moment, I simply stood there, staring at him. I was convinced I had misunderstood what he said. "What?" I asked quietly. "Your services are no longer required," he repeated. I looked from him to the HR representative, waiting for someone to explain what was happening. "There must be some mistake," I said. "There is no mistake," the HR representative replied. "This decision has already been finalized." I took a deep breath and tried to remain calm. "At least tell me why." My manager leaned back in his chair. "Company policy." That was all he said. I knew it was a lie. For weeks, I had noticed irregularities in several financial reports. Certain numbers didn't add up. Expenses had been approved without proper documentation. Payments had been made to questionable vendors. I'd raised concerns privately and suggested that the matter should be reviewed by senior leadership. Apparently, that had been my mistake. Instead of investigating the issue, they had decided to remove the person who noticed it. The realization hit me like a punch to the chest. After 7 years of loyalty, they were throwing me away as if I had never mattered. A security guard escorted me to my desk while I collected my belongings. My coworkers watched from a distance. Some looked embarrassed. Others looked sympathetic. A few avoided eye contact altogether. No one said a word. I placed my family photo, a notebook, and a few personal items into a small cardboard box. Then I walked out of the building for what I believed would be the last time. As the glass doors closed behind me, it felt as though 7 years of hard work had vanished in a single moment. The walk home felt longer than ever. My mind was filled with questions. How would I pay the rent? How would I cover my bills? How would I afford my mother's medication? I had some savings, but not enough to survive for long without a job. By the time I reached my small rented house, exhaustion had settled into every part of my body. Across the street, my neighbor, Mrs. Aisha, was watering flowers in her garden. Her 8-year-old daughter, Miriam, was playing among the colorful plants, humming happily to herself. Miriam was the kind of child who could brighten an entire neighborhood with a single smile. The moment she saw me, she ran across the yard toward me. Normally, I would have greeted her with a smile, but that day, I couldn't. She stopped in front of me and tilted her head. "Uncle, why do you look so sad today?" I tried to smile, but my voice betrayed me. "I lost my job today, kiddo." She stared at me for a few seconds, trying to understand. Then she asked a question only a child would ask. "Did you do something bad?" I shook my head. "No, never." She thought about that for a moment. Then she nodded confidently. "Then God will make things right." Her words were simple, yet somehow, they carried more comfort than anything an adult could have said. I smiled for the first time that day. "Thank you, Miriam." That evening, I sat alone in my small living room, staring at the termination letter. I read it over and over again, hoping the words would somehow change. They never did. The next morning, I began searching for another job. I updated my resume and spent hours sending applications. One company wanted more experience. Another had already filled the position. A third never replied. Days passed. Then more days. My savings began shrinking faster than I expected. Every rejection made me feel smaller. Every unanswered email felt like another door closing. Yet through it all, there was one person who never stopped encouraging me. Every evening, Miriam knocked on my door. Sometimes she brought me tea her mother had made. Sometimes she showed me drawings she had colored. Sometimes she simply sat beside me and talked about school. And every time she left, she reminded me of the same thing. Don't give up, uncle. Good things happen to good people. I wanted to believe her. I truly did. But with each passing day, hope became harder to hold on to. One evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, Miriam came to my door with a warm cup of tea in her hands. She smiled the way she always did. But this time, there was something thoughtful in her eyes. She handed me the cup and sat quietly on the front steps beside me. After a few moments of silence, she looked up at me and said, "If someone has been unfair to you, my dad always says that the truth wins in the end." Her words caught my attention. I smiled faintly and asked, "Really? Where is your dad these days?" For a brief moment, her cheerful expression faded. "He travels most of the time," she answered softly. "He's always busy with work." I nodded and decided not to ask any more questions. Everyone in the neighborhood knew that Mrs. Aisha was raising Miriam on her own. Her father was rarely seen, and people assumed he lived in another city because of his business. That night, I sat by my bedroom window, staring into the quiet street outside. My thoughts were filled with uncertainty. I had no idea what tomorrow would bring or how much longer I could survive without a job. As I sat there, I heard Miriam's cheerful voice coming from outside. She was talking on the phone. "Daddy," she said excitedly, "that uncle I told you about is such a good person. He shouldn't be crying. You always told me that if someone is treated unfairly, we should help them. Can you help him?" I couldn't hear the reply on the other end. A few seconds later, she smiled brightly. "I knew you would. Thank you, Daddy. You're the best." I smiled to myself and closed the window. I assumed it was nothing more than an innocent conversation between a little girl and her father. I never imagined those few words would soon change my life forever. 2 days later, at around 10 o'clock in the morning, the quiet neighborhood was suddenly filled with the sound of expensive engines. Several black luxury SUVs slowly pulled up in front of our houses. Neighbors stepped outside in confusion. Curtains opened. Children stopped playing. Everyone wondered who could possibly be arriving in such an impressive convoy. The doors of the first vehicle opened. A tall man in an elegant dark suit stepped out, followed by several assistants and security personnel. He looked calm, confident, and incredibly important. Without saying a word to anyone, he walked directly toward Mrs. Aisha's house. Before he reached the front door, it swung open. Miriam came running outside with a huge smile on her face. "Daddy." She threw her arms around him, and he lifted her into a warm embrace. I froze. This was her father. He certainly wasn't an ordinary businessman. A few minutes later, Mrs. Aisha walked across the street and knocked gently on my door. "He would like to meet you," she said politely. I hesitated. "Me?" She nodded. "Yes. He's waiting." Curious and a little nervous, I followed her across the street. The man stepped forward with a friendly smile and extended his hand. "My name is Fahad Malik." The moment I heard his name, I felt the ground disappear beneath my feet. Fahad Malik, the founder and billionaire owner of the very company where I had worked for 7 years. Although everyone in the company knew his name, very few employees had ever met him in person. He spent most of his time overseas, visiting only when major business decisions required his attention. I stood there speechless. He smiled warmly. "My daughter has been talking about you every single day for the past 2 weeks, he said. I didn't know how to respond. He looked directly into my eyes. "Is it true that you were fired without a proper reason?" For the first time since losing my job, someone genuinely wanted to hear my side of the story. I took a deep breath and explained everything from the financial irregularities I had discovered to the questions I had asked, and finally to the sudden termination without any explanation. He listened carefully without interrupting me even once. When I finished, He remained silent for several seconds. Finally, he spoke. "Be at the company tomorrow morning." I looked at him in surprise. "We're going together." There was something about the confidence in his voice that immediately gave me hope. For the first time in days, I felt that perhaps the truth was finally about to be heard. The next morning, I arrived at the company's headquarters earlier than scheduled. This time, however, I wasn't alone. A black luxury car pulled up to the entrance, and Fahad Malik stepped out. The moment employees recognized him, the atmosphere inside the building changed instantly. Managers rushed through the hallways. Assistants whispered to one another, and security staff stood at attention. No one had expected the company's billionaire owner to appear without notice. Without wasting a single minute, Fahad walked straight through the lobby and headed toward the executive conference room. "Call every senior manager," he instructed firmly. "I want everyone here immediately." Within minutes, the room was filled with executives, department heads, HR representatives, and my former manager. The confidence they usually carried had completely disappeared. My former manager's face had turned pale the moment he saw me standing beside the owner. Fahad looked around the room before speaking. "I want every financial report, every contract, every payment record, and every internal audit file from the past 12 months on this table within the next 30 minutes. No one dared question the order. The company's internal audit team had already been contacted before we arrived. They immediately began reviewing documents, emails, financial transactions, and approval records. Hours passed in complete silence. One by one, the hidden secrets began to surface. Millions of dollars had been diverted through fake vendors. False expense reports had been approved. Several contracts had been manipulated to benefit private accounts. Documents had been altered to hide the fraud, and every piece of evidence pointed to the same group of senior executives. The room became so quiet that no one could even look at one another. Finally, Fahad closed the last file and slowly stood up. He looked directly at my former manager. "You didn't fire this man because he was a bad employee." His voice was calm, but every word carried enormous weight. "You fired him because he discovered what you were trying to hide." No one spoke. No one denied it. Fahad turned toward the rest of the executives. "You chose to sacrifice an honest employee to protect your own corruption." The silence was all the confession anyone needed. He immediately instructed the company's legal department to suspend every executive involved in the fraud. Their company access was revoked on the spot. Security officers escorted them out of the building one by one. Several criminal investigations were launched before the meeting had even ended. My former manager tried desperately to explain himself. "Sir, please. I can explain everything." Fahad looked at him without the slightest emotion. When an honest person begged for fairness, you never gave him the chance to explain. Then he pointed toward the door. "Now it's your turn to leave." The manager lowered his head and quietly walked away. For the first time since I had lost my job, I felt that justice had finally arrived. After everyone else had left the conference room, Fahad turned toward me. "I owe you an apology," he said sincerely. "I built this company on honesty, yet dishonest people managed to abuse the trust I placed in them." I shook my head. "You don't owe me anything. You weren't here when it happened." He smiled slightly. "Maybe not, but it's my responsibility to make it right." He paused before asking, "Would you be willing to return to the company?" I looked around the conference room where my life had fallen apart just days earlier. The memories were still painful. I took a deep breath before answering. "I appreciate the offer, but I don't think I belong here anymore. I'd rather start a new chapter than return to the place where I lost my dignity." Instead of looking disappointed, Fahad smiled. "I was hoping you'd say that." He opened a folder and slid it across the table. "I have something better in mind." I looked down. Inside was an offer to become the director of one of his charitable foundations, a program dedicated to helping honest, hardworking young people find employment, receive professional training, and rebuild their lives after hardship. "I need someone people can trust," Fahad said. "My daughter believed in you before anyone else did. Now I do too." My eyes filled with tears. For the first time in weeks, they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of hope.